1887 Montana Territory. The winter wind swept across the open plains like a living thing, carrying snow over the endless fields and rattling the wooden buildings of the small frontier town. Most people hurried indoors before sunset, eager to escape the bitter cold. But one man rode through the storm as if it were nothing. Ethan Cole sat tall in the saddle of his black horse, his broad shoulders covered by a heavy ranch coat. At 34 years old, he was already a legend throughout the territory. Standing 6 feet 9 inches in tall with powerful muscles built from years of hard labor, Ethan looked less like an ordinary rancher and more like a mountain carved into human form. Long dark hair brushed against the collar of his coat, and his deep-set eyes rarely revealed what he was thinking. He spoke little, worked hard, and carried himself with quiet confidence. Most people simply called him one thing: the giant. Ethan owned the largest ranch for miles. Thousands of acres stretched across his land along with hundreds of cattle and some of the finest horses in Montana Territory. By every measure, he was successful. Yet success did little to warm an empty home. As he rode toward town that evening, he passed families gathering around supper tables, children laughing behind frosted windows, and husbands helping their wives carry firewood inside. Those simple sights always stirred something painful inside him. For years, Ethan had hoped to find someone to share his life with. He wasn't looking for beauty or wealth. He only wanted companionship, a woman who could see beyond his intimidating appearance. But that dream had slowly faded. Women often became nervous around him. Some were frightened by his size before he even spoke a word. Others whispered that he looked too stern, too serious, too different. The men weren't much better. Many secretly envied his success. They admired his ranch while resenting the man who owned it. Over time, Ethan had accepted a difficult truth. He would probably spend the rest of his life alone. The thought no longer shocked him. It simply hurt. As darkness settled over the town, a stagecoach finally arrived through the snow. The passengers quickly hurried away, eager to find warmth before the storm worsened. One woman remained standing beside the coach. She looked lost. Her name was Dawn Whitmore. At 26 years old, Dawn possessed a natural beauty that even exhaustion couldn't hide. Snowflakes rested on her chestnut hair while the cold turned her cheeks pale. She clutched a worn suitcase with trembling fingers and looked around the unfamiliar town with uncertainty in her eyes. Only a few months earlier, her life had been completely different. Her husband had died suddenly after a terrible fever swept through their community. While she was still grieving, his greedy relatives had taken advantage of her vulnerability. They challenged ownership of the small property she and her husband had shared and eventually forced her from her home. Now everything she had once known was gone. No husband, no land, no family willing to help, no place to sleep. Dawn approached several townspeople as the storm grew stronger. "Excuse me," she asked politely. "Do you know somewhere I could stay for a few days?" Most barely stopped walking. One woman shook her head and hurried away. A shopkeeper claimed he had no room. Another man muttered that he didn't want to become involved in someone else's family problems. Each rejection felt colder than the wind itself. Within an hour, Dawn stood alone near the center of town, fighting tears. She had traveled hundreds of miles, searching for a fresh start. Now she wasn't even sure she would survive the night. That was when a large shadow stopped nearby. Dawn looked up and up and up. The enormous rancher standing before her seemed almost unreal. For a moment, she understood why people called him the giant. Ethan studied her quietly. He had noticed her speaking to people all evening and had seen every one of them turn her away. "What happened?" he finally asked. His voice was deep but surprisingly gentle. Dawn hesitated before explaining her situation. She expected another rejection. Instead, Ethan nodded once. "I have an empty cabin on my ranch." Dawn blinked. "What?" "It's old," he said. "But it's warm. You can stay there." She stared at him in disbelief. "How much do I owe you?" "Nothing. There must be some condition." "There isn't. Dawn searched his face, trying to understand why a stranger would offer such kindness. But Ethan simply picked up her suitcase. "You'll freeze if we stay here talking." A short time later, they arrived at a small cabin near the edge of Ethan's property. Though simple, it was clean, warm, and far more comfortable than Dawn had expected. After lighting the stove and making sure she had enough firewood, Ethan moved toward the door. "Thank you," Dawn said softly. Ethan gave a small nod. Then he stepped back into the storm. From the cabin window, Dawn watched his enormous figure disappear into the swirling snow. For the first time since her husband's death, she felt something she hadn't felt in months. The townspeople had feared him. They had called him intimidating. Yet, he was the only person who had shown her kindness. As the snow continued falling outside, Dawn stared into the darkness where he had vanished and quietly asked herself a question. Who is this giant everyone fears? Winter slowly loosened its grip on Montana territory. The endless white fields around Ethan Cole's ranch gradually gave way to patches of brown earth and fresh green grass. Snow melted from fence posts, streams began flowing again, and the first signs of spring appeared across the valley. For Dawn Whitmore, the changing season felt like a second chance. Several weeks had passed since Ethan had given her the small cabin on his ranch. What had begun as an act of kindness had become the foundation of a new life. Dawn refused to be a burden. From the very beginning, she insisted on earning her place. She helped repair clothes for ranch hands, cooked meals when extra help was needed, organized supplies, and assisted with bookkeeping whenever possible. Her education and neat handwriting quickly proved valuable. Before long, Ethan's foreman was bringing her records that needed sorting and accounts that needed balancing. The work gave Dawn something she had not possessed for months. Purpose. Each morning, she woke with a reason to get out of bed. Each evening, she returned to her cabin knowing she had earned every meal she ate. Most importantly, she no longer felt helpless. One morning, while delivering records to the main ranch house, Dawn witnessed something unexpected. A ranch hand came riding into the yard with an injured horse. The animal was limping badly and trembling with pain. Several workers gathered around nervously. "She's finished," one man muttered. "Legs too damaged." Another nodded. "Probably best to put her down." Dawn watched Ethan walk toward the frightened horse. The giant rancher placed one massive hand gently against the animal's neck. The horse immediately calmed. For nearly an hour, Ethan remained beside her. He cleaned the wound himself, wrapped the injury carefully, and personally prepared a stall where the horse could recover. "She still has a chance," he said firmly. The ranch hands exchanged doubtful looks, but Ethan ignored them. Over the following weeks, Dawn watched him visit the horse every day. By spring, the animal was walking again. The sight stayed with Dawn. Most people only saw Ethan's strength. Very few noticed his compassion, but Dawn was beginning to see it everywhere. A few days later, another incident deepened her admiration. A fierce late-season snowstorm swept across the valley unexpectedly. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. Most ranchers stayed indoors. Yet, when a young worker reported that a newborn calf had become separated from its mother, Ethan immediately saddled his horse. "You can't go out in this weather," Dawn protested. Ethan simply pulled on his gloves. "If I don't, that calf won't survive the night." Hours passed. Darkness arrived. The storm continued raging. Dawn found herself pacing near the window, worried despite herself. Finally, the ranch house door opened. Ethan stepped inside, covered in snow from head to toe. Cradled in his massive arms, was the tiny calf. The animal was weak, but alive. Ethan's face was red from the cold, and exhaustion showed in every movement. Yet, he looked relieved. Not because he had survived, because the calf had. That night, Dawn realized something important. Ethan's kindness wasn't occasional. It was part of who he was. The discovery continued in the weeks that followed. One afternoon, Dawn traveled into town for supplies. While passing the doctor's office, she noticed Ethan speaking quietly with the physician. Neither of them saw her. Curious, Dawn stepped inside after Ethan left. The doctor smiled knowingly. "He's done it again." "What do you mean?" Dawn asked. The doctor glanced toward the door. "One of the orphan boys has been sick for weeks. Couldn't afford medicine." Understanding slowly crossed Dawn's face. "Ethan paid for it." The doctor nodded like he always does. "Does the boy know?" "No." "And his caretaker?" "No." The doctor chuckled softly. "That's how Ethan prefers it." Dawn stood silently. Most wealthy men enjoyed being praised for their generosity. Ethan seemed determined to hide his. The discoveries continued. One evening, she noticed him loading sacks of flour, dried beans, and supplies into a wagon after sunset. Thinking it was ranch business, she paid little attention. Hours later, unable to sleep, she glanced through her window. The wagon was returning. Curiosity finally got the better of her. The next week, she quietly followed from a distance. What she witnessed left her speechless. Ethan wasn't delivering supplies to customers. He was leaving food on the porches of struggling families throughout the valley. Widows, elderly couples, families whose crops had failed. He left the supplies anonymously and departed before anyone saw him. Dawn watched from the shadows. Her chest tightened. For months, she had wondered why Ethan had helped her. Now she finally understood. Helping people wasn't something he occasionally did. It was simply who he was. As spring deepened into early summer, Dawn and Ethan naturally began spending more time together. At first, their interactions remained practical. Work discussions, supply inventories, ranch matters, small conversations. But gradually those conversations became longer, more personal, more meaningful. Some evenings they sat on the porch outside the main ranch house after supper. The vast Montana sky stretched endlessly above them. Stars filled the darkness. Crickets sang in the fields. Ethan rarely talked about himself, but Dawn discovered pieces of his life little by little. His parents had died when he was young. He had built the ranch through years of relentless labor. Most of his adulthood had been spent working, building, expanding, surviving. There had never been much room for anything else. "What about family?" Dawn asked one evening. Ethan stared toward the distant mountains. "Never happened." "You never wanted one?" A faint smile appeared. "I wanted one." The answer carried enough sadness to make Dawn's heart ache. Another evening, they shared coffee while watching a sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and orange. Dawn laughed at one of Ethan's rare jokes. The sound surprised them both. For a moment, Ethan simply stared at her. The setting sun illuminated her face. Her smile, her eyes, something stirred inside him. Something dangerous. Because by then, Ethan had already fallen in love. He simply refused to admit it. At night, he often found himself thinking about Dawn, her kindness, her courage, the way she treated every ranch worker with respect, the warmth she brought into every room, the way his lonely ranch no longer felt empty when she was nearby. But those thoughts always led to the same painful conclusion. She could never feel the same way. Ethan saw himself through the eyes of others. A giant, too tall, too intimidating, too rough around the edges. Too old, too different. Dawn was beautiful, intelligent, and graceful. Surely someone better suited for her would eventually appear. Someone younger, someone charming, someone who didn't make children stare in amazement whenever he entered town. So Ethan buried his feelings. He convinced himself friendship was enough. It had to be. Meanwhile, Dawn was fighting a very different battle. At first, she had been grateful. Then, she had become curious. Now, she was something far more dangerous. She was falling in love. Not with Ethan's ranch, not with his wealth, not with his reputation, with him. She loved the way he protected the vulnerable. She loved his quiet humility. She loved how he never demanded attention despite deserving respect. Most of all, she loved the gentleness hidden beneath his intimidating appearance. The giant everyone feared possessed the kindest heart she had ever known. One afternoon, Dawn found herself watching Ethan repair a fence. Sweat glistened on his forehead beneath the summer sun. A group of children passed nearby. One little girl tripped and scraped her knee. Before anyone else reacted, Ethan crossed the distance in seconds. He knelt beside her carefully, spoke softly, helped her stand, made her laugh, then returned to work. Dawn couldn't stop smiling. In that moment, she realized the truth. She was completely in love with him. Yet, she wasn't sure he felt the same. Ethan remained respectful and protective, but distant whenever conversations grew too personal. Neither of them knew how close happiness truly was. Then trouble arrived. It happened on an ordinary afternoon. Dawn had traveled into town to purchase supplies. The streets were busy. Merchants shouted from storefronts. Wagons rolled through muddy roads. Everything seemed normal until she saw two men climbing down from a wagon. The moment Dawn recognized them, all warmth drained from her face. Fear gripped her chest. The men looked older than she remembered, but their expressions remained exactly the same. Cold, greedy, cruel. They were Samuel and Richard Whitmore, her late husband's brothers. The very men responsible for stealing her home. The very men who had left her homeless. The very men she had hoped never to see again. Their eyes locked onto hers. A slow smile spread across Samuel's face. Not a pleasant smile. A predator's smile. That evening they found her. "We've been looking for you," Samuel said. Dawn's stomach tightened. "What do you want? What belongs to us?" "You already took everything." Richard laughed. "Not everything." Over the following days, the brothers spread throughout town like poison. They told lies about Dawn. Claimed she had stolen money. Claimed she owed debts. Claimed she had fled to avoid responsibility. Most of the stories were absurd. But gossip traveled quickly in small towns. Soon whispers followed Dawn wherever she went. The brothers then began making demands. They claimed Dawn still owed them property, money, compensation, anything they could invent. When she refused, their behavior became more aggressive. Threats replaced requests. Intimidation replaced conversation. Dawn tried to remain strong, but old fears returned. She remembered losing her home, her security, everything she had built. And now, for the first time in months, she feared losing it all again. One afternoon, the confrontation became public. A crowd gathered near the center of town. Samuel stepped forward while Richard stood beside him. Their voices carried across the street. "We gave you a chance to cooperate." Dawn stood her ground despite trembling hands. "I owe you nothing." Samuel's eyes hardened. "Then listen carefully." The crowd fell silent. Even the wind seemed to stop. The older brother pointed directly at her. His voice echoed through the street. "Leave town willingly or we'll make sure you're forced out." The threat hung in the air. No one intervened. No one spoke. No one stepped forward. Dawn looked around at the faces surrounding her. Some appeared uncomfortable. Others looked away, but nobody helped. A familiar feeling settled over her. The same feeling she had experienced when she lost her home. Alone, terrifyingly alone. As the brothers walked away, Dawn remained frozen in place. Her heart pounded. Fear tightened around her chest. For the first time since arriving at Ethan's ranch, she wondered whether happiness had only been temporary, whether the life she had rebuilt was about to be taken from her once again. And as the crowd slowly dispersed, Dawn realized with growing dread that the real battle was only beginning. The threat followed Dawn Whitmore everywhere. For days after the confrontation in town, she could feel the weight of Samuel and Richard Whitmore's words hanging over her like a storm cloud. Leave town willingly or we'll make sure you're forced out. The sentence echoed through her mind when she woke in the morning. It haunted her during meals. It lingered in the silence of the night. Although she tried to remain strong, fear slowly found its way back into her heart. She had fought so hard to rebuild her life. For the first time since her husband's death, she had begun feeling secure. The little cabin on Ethan's ranch had become a home. The ranch workers had become friends. The valley had become her future. Now she feared losing all of it again. What frightened her most was the silence. The townspeople knew Samuel and Richard were lying. Many suspected the brothers were simply trying to squeeze money from a vulnerable widow. Yet nobody spoke up. Nobody challenged them. Nobody wanted trouble. When Dawn walked through town, conversations often stopped. People looked away. Some offered sympathetic smiles. Others avoided eye contact completely. But sympathy was not the same as courage. Afraid. A familiar set of footsteps approached. Dawn quickly wiped her eyes. Ethan stepped onto the porch carrying a lantern. His large frame cast a long shadow across the wooden boards. For a moment, he simply stood there. "You're worried," he said quietly. Dawn attempted a smile. "I'm fine." Ethan looked unconvinced. "You don't have to pretend with me." The kindness in his voice nearly broke her composure. For several seconds, she stared at the horizon. Then everything came pouring out. The fear, the uncertainty, the threats, the memories of losing her home, the fear of losing this one, too. Ethan listened without interrupting, without judging, without offering empty promises. When she finally finished speaking, silence settled between them. Then Ethan spoke. "You're not alone anymore, Dawn." The simple statement carried more comfort than any speech could have. For the first time in days, she felt herself breathe easier. Neither of them realized how soon those words would be tested. 3 days later, trouble arrived again. It was a busy afternoon in town. Wagons crowded the streets. Merchants called out from storefronts. Children ran between buildings while ranchers discussed livestock prices. Dawn had traveled into town to purchase supplies for the ranch. At first, everything seemed normal. Then Samuel and Richard appeared. They stepped into the street directly in front of her, blocking her path. Dawn's stomach tightened. Around them, people immediately sensed trouble. Conversations stopped. Curious onlookers gathered nearby. Within moments, a crowd had formed. Samuel smiled coldly. "We need to talk." Dawn stood her ground.